Hello and welcome to the EDHRECast, where we're all about commander, data, and dad jokes. I'm Joey Schultz, and I'm joined, as always, by my fantastic co-hosts. Up first, he puts the win in AOWin. It's Matt Morgan.
Joey, what is the difference between toilet paper and curtains?
I don't know.
Oh, so it was you. So I will be sending you a cleaning bill, and I will expect payment very promptly. I thought it was the dog.
Wow.
You're never coming to my house again.
Holy crap. Literally. Wow.
Right.
And it's come full circle right there. I think we should just wipe this from our memory and let's move on.
Yep, let's move on. Well played, Matt. Okay, up next, he puts the AO in AOWin. It's Dana Roach.
Why did Humpty Dumpty have a great fall?
I have no idea, Dana.
He had to make up for his hot, miserable summer.
Joey's like a real-life ginger brute. You're never going to catch the joke. Oh, man.
I think I was just like so completely demolished by what you did, Matt, that I'm just like, honestly, my brain's going to be completely off the rails for this episode. So like, Matt, I have forgotten at this point, what is it that we're actually talking about in this podcast episode this week?
Well, this week we're going to talk about cards that we wish we had more decks to play them in or more opportunities, because they're fun cards and we like them, but we just don't ever have a chance to put them in very many decks.
Yeah, I wish I had a deck for the episode. Cards that we want to build around, but we just don't have a place to put them yet. And maybe that might inspire us about like potential decks that we could put these into. I think it'll be a whole lot of fun. But we've got some shoutouts to do before we get to it.
First, I want to thank Chase, also known as Mana Curves, for help editing the show. You can find them on Twitter at Mana Curves.
Also, do you know Coalesce Apparel? You should. They make some amazing Magic-themed merch. If you want an Atraxa shirt that attracts attention, check them out. And of course, check out the EDHREC collection while you're there. But no matter what you get, make sure you use code EDHREC at checkout for 10% off your order.
And if you'd like to support the show, you can do so by liking, subscribing to this video on YouTube, subscribing to the local podcast app, leaving a review on your podcast app, or by going to patreon.com/EDHRECast, where we have patron tiers of all sorts of levels, where you can hear me own Joey so publicly a day earlier than all of your friends. You can do that and more over at patreon.com/EDHRECast, including the weekly patron shoutouts. So this week we are going to give a very special thank you to Daniel Murta. So Daniel, hopefully you don't murder your friends with the spell murder.
Oh, no. Matt.
There was a player for Kansas State basketball back in the early 2000s whose name was Jermaine Maybank, who went by Murda. I don't know why he called himself that, but Daniel, either way, thank you for reminding me that Jermaine Maybank is an obscure basketball player from the early 2000s.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I think that we can say that Matt, with your opening joke, you committed a murder on me. And I'm also sure that Daniel has never heard any jokes at the expense of his last name ever before. So Daniel, we really do appreciate you. Thank you for putting up with us.
I've done so many murdas in this opener that I might get locked in an obliute for all my crimes.
Brutal, Matt.
Oh, no. Yeah.
So how about the episode? How about that episode?
Honestly, no, you're inspiring me. Like, maybe we should have an episode just about all the stuff we've mispronounced over the years.
We very much could.
It'd be a long one. Dana, how about we get the show kicked off? What's a card that you wish you had a deck for? Like, you love this card, but you don't currently have a place to put it.
The card would be Amanatu's Augury. It's an 8-mana sorcery, 6 blue. Exile the top 8 cards of your library. You may put a land card from among them onto the battlefield. And until the end of the turn, for each non-land card type, you may cast a card of that type from among the exiled cards without paying its mana cost. And technically this card has gotten even better now that we have battles out there that just gives you one more card type you can possibly hit here.
Oh.
It's one of those things, though, where like whenever I've tried it, I just don't have any blue decks that really have the correct mix of cards that consistently get enough value out of it to justify putting it into a deck. Either I just don't have planeswalkers or battles in that particular deck, or like I look at it, I'm like, well, there's only 3 enchantments and there's only 15 creatures, and like it just never feels like I have a deck where the distribution is such that I can justify running it and believing I'm going to regularly get that 8 mana worth of value out of it.
See, I just want to point out that 8 mana for blue to exile 8 cards and maybe get a land, that just shows how bad of a rate mono blue gets when it comes to ramp spells.
Wow.
That's my takeaway.
And the reality is, I mean, like you're gonna get a land every time, and you're probably gonna get 2 spells out of it, but like it's very, given how blue tends to functions too, your instants might wind up all being counter spells, or they might wind up being a brainstorm-esque draw spell. Heck, you could hit that for your sorcery as well. Blue's creatures, unless you're running a really specific kind of deck, tend to not have that high casting cost either. Like it's just the kind of card that, at least in the decks that I tend to play, I could very easily see myself, casting it and then walking away with a land and an arcane signet and a brainstorm, and that just doesn't feel good.
No, I do feel you on that one. I actually do have this in a deck of my own. I have it in my Ynet Cryptic Sovereign deck because that deck is all about top deck manipulation. So it's pretty easy for me to actually like brainstorm and put 2 very high cost things on top and make sure that even just with the top 2 cards of the deck, I know that I'm going to get like the Angel of the Ruins, which can count as my artifact because it's an artifact creature. And I'll flip an amazing, like an Angel of Despair and a bunch of other cool stuff into play off of that. But that is the only deck I've been able to justify it because I feel like I know what I'm able to set up with that card and I'm willing to roll the dice on the other like 6 cards that I won't know about. And in any other blue deck, I'm just like, this one's pretty devoted to like just a lot of sorceries, or this one is just all artifacts. So I'm not going to get an actual even spread. So I totally see why this one is tough. It's a lot of value, but you do need to have the deck shaped around it a little bit more for it to feel like you are definitely getting the value you should get from it.
Well, you almost kind of got to treat it like a cascade type of card. Like we talk a lot about how you want to be careful about what kind of decks you're putting all these cascade spells into. Amanatu's Augury kind of has the same feeling as you got to be careful with your deck building. If you're playing Cascade, for example, you don't want to be playing just straight counterspell. You want to be playing something bigger than that. Same thing. Dana, I feel like Amanatu's Augury probably isn't bad in like your Sphinx Typal deck because you're playing big expensive creatures. You have a good array of sorceries, instants that aren't just straight counterspells either. So I feel like that might be a good home if you want to try it out there. That might be a suggestion for me.
I did try it there. That was the one deck where I ran it a few times.
Okay.
And again, I had that problem where it would hit a Sphinx for like 5 mana, and I would hit a land off it, and then I would hit a Winged Words or something. And I guess it was never terrible, but it never felt like it was good enough to justify filling that 8 mana kind of home run slot. And
right.
And again, to be clear, that's not necessarily like, we're not talking about cards that are overrated or don't perform. We're talking about ones that just don't quite work for us, that we don't have a home for. And I think that's why I started with this one. I think it's a really good card. I think there's a lot of decks where it will hit all of those things consistently enough to justify the 8 mana. I just don't have one of those decks, right? Like it doesn't work for me, even though I think the card is super cool.
Oh yeah.
The way I tend to brew and the way my blue decks are brewed, it just doesn't work for me.
Oh yeah, make no mistake. The cards that we're talking about in this episode are not cards in our maybe board.
Right.
These are cards that were like, I wish I had. These are good cards. And like the one that inspired this episode for me was a new one. Matt, you'll love this. Taunt from the Rampart, which is from the new Lord of the Rings stuff. This card's cracked. This card's amazing. I cannot wait to cast this card. I don't have a deck that can actually currently play it. Taunt from the Rampart is a 5 mana Boros sorcery. Goad all creatures your opponents control until your next turn those creatures can't block. It's better Disrupt Decorum. It's amazing. And I have a Goad deck, so I saw this card. I love it. The problem is that my Goad deck is Rakdos. I cannot play this card, but I want to. So I'm like, do I just build a random Boros deck or a Jeskai deck or whatever just to have an excuse to play this card? Because I just want to play this card. I just want this card in any place that I can play it, but I don't currently have a Boros deck.
Yeah, this card, I played a lot with the precons just straight out of the box for the Lord of the Rings sets. This card was, every time you saw it, it was the MVP of the game. It was just almost unbeatable because the decks are all about building up this massive board states, and then all of a sudden somebody just randomly casts a Taunt from the Rampart. Well, oh my gosh. Well, you have to block all my stuff, but they can't block this turn, and it's such a mess, but it's such a blowout. It's like Arachnogenesis style blowouts. It's one of those huge things that just, when somebody casts it, you know that like more than likely 2 people at the table aren't getting to untap.
Yeah, this thing is so absolutely awesome. I love this. And you know what? Sort of tacking one more onto this, I think I also want to mention that, like, I also wish that I could play more Brash Taunter in my life, which I feel like also is kind of akin to this similar type of thing. Brash Taunter is the 5-mana 1/1 goblin with Indestructible, basically a stuffy doll. Whenever it is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to target opponent, and it can also fight an opponent's creature as well. That's sort of in the same style. Like, in my head, I have Taunt the Rampart and Brash Taunter, just like in the same thing. I'm like, can I build a deck that uses weird combat buffoonery in this way? And I don't have an actual way to concretize those just yet, but those are cards that I keep looking at them. I'm like, dang, I need to put these into a deck. They don't currently work in any of the decks I've actually got because they're a little bit too defensive, or the colors are off, or whatever, compared to the, aggro stuff I'm actually up to, or the graveyard shenanigans I'm trying to do. But I just look at those cards longingly, Yeah,
Joey, I totally get it. So one of my favorite cards that I've wanted a home for this for so long, and I've brewed so many decks that just never came together, trying to make us, like, I've made decks trying to make a stupid a common. It's not even an uncommon. It's a common from Journey to Nyx. Grim Guardian. I know I've talked about this card a few times on the podcast, that I want this to have a home, but black just doesn't seem to be the best place for Enchantment Matters decks. And so I've never just been able to find a place for this. So Grim Guardian is 2 and a black for an enchantment creature zombie that's a 1/4 that has Constellation. And whenever Grim Guardian or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent loses 1 life. So we have Blood Artist effects left and right, but we've never had one for an enchantment. So I was always intrigued by this. I've tried doing myriad stuff with enchantment creatures. I've tried doing Encores. I've tried all of the different mechanics to, like, try and make as many enchantments explode, and just nothing's ever really come together. And it's so frustrating. It's so annoying because I don't have an Enchantment Matters decks anyways. So I'm dedicated to, like, trying to make this work if I'm brewing a deck to make a stupid common from Journey to Nyx be something worth playing.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of the homes for this have been like Daxus the Returned or Lind Cheerful Tormentor. And Daxus is that's the black-white Daxus experience. And it's like pretty slow, or Lind is like, I'm very curse focused. And that doesn't seem to be the kind of thing that you actually want to do with enchantments. There is the upcoming Onyxia Hand of Erebus, which is coming up in the future. I'm not sure if that will be something that maybe, like, calls out to you. There have been decks in the past, but I feel like, knowing you, what you want to do is very similar to, like, the Tuvasa style of Enchantress deck, where I'm just like, play enchantments, go big, smash face, commander big, and you want, like, to get a lot of Grim Guardian triggers or Doomwig Giant triggers, and, like, a lot of those other things don't quite line up with that, which is probably why they haven't called you, is my guess.
Mostly, yeah. And there were a whole bunch of different things. I mean, I was trying to make Myriad happen so that I could attack with an enchantment creature and make a bunch of copies of it, and maybe I could, like, encore something from the graveyard, and that would get some more triggers. But, like, it ended up being a lot of work when just Blood Artist would have killed, like, the whole table by the time I got 3 Grim Guardian triggers. So it was just, It was frustrating because it was so stinking slow. And I'm sure, yeah, Onyxia does look very intriguing. Maybe there's some possibility there. I don't know. I definitely have to revisit this, though, because every year or so, I'm like, you know what? I have this random foil Grim Guardian. I just want a home for it. It's just so lonely sitting in the box by itself.
Wait, Matt, I've got it. Esper enchantments, you play Enchanted Evening, so everything's an enchantment, and then you just got, like, a bunch of tokens and lands into play, and that's a bunch of consolation triggers, etc., profit something.
Well, I think it's one of those things where, like, if you're playing Orzhov Enchantress or you're playing Golgari Enchantress, it probably isn't quite good enough in those color combinations to, like, really make you enjoy it.
Yeah.
And if you are playing something like Abzan, where you have access to both white and green, you don't need it then, because you have access to white and green Enchantress stuff, and then you just have all of the tools already, so this becomes less useful. So yeah, there's just not quite the right niche for it so far.
No, that makes a whole lot of sense. I'll move to another one of mine here. And Matt, this is a card that I know you love. I've seen you use it to great effect. And I'm sad that I don't have a play. It's another red card. I apparently need to build a red deck one of these days. Matt, what do you think of Surge to Victory from Strixhaven? Oh, yeah.
That card is a story maker. Like, J.R.R. Tolkien isn't even as good at writing stories as Surge to Victory.
Wow, and you are a big... Yeah, you're a big Lord of the Rings fanboy, so like, whew, that sounds like blasphemy, but it ain't. Because yeah, this card makes some stuff happen. It's a 6-mana sorcery, exile target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard, and then creatures you control get a power buff equal to the mana value of that card. And whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player this turn, you copy that exiled card, and you can cast that copy without paying its mana cost. I have a couple of decks that include red, but like, for example, my Karazakar deck I mentioned earlier, that has a lot of big beefy creatures and not a whole lot of high mana instants and sorceries. Or like I have the precon that this card came in, the Zephi precon. And that's good there, but it wasn't perfect there because that was much more of a regular storm spellslingy type of deck. I'll win with like gutter snipe kind of effects rather than winning with combat. So this one I felt like it's just between two homes, and I'm like, I need to find a place to put this. And what I think I would want it to be is just like, here's a bunch of freaking tokens and just get a huge buff and then cast, I don't even know what, like, Matt, what's the most fun spell that you've cast off of a Surge to Victory with that buff before? Like, there's...
So, I mean, I won the game once by getting rid of a Seize the Day. That was a lot of fun because I was just able to get all the combat steps. That was really good. That was really, really good. But there's a couple other big ones. I want to say that's the one that stands out immediately to mind. I know I've cast a couple other just massive haymakers. So actually one time I saw somebody get rid of a Living End with this. And
oh my.
I think there are like 17 Living Ends cast in one turn. And it was absolutely ludicrous watching and trying to figure out what all happened.
Oh no. See, that's what I want in life. That's what I want in life and in Living Death. That's this card's so good. I just need to like actually make a deck that can play it. I want it. That's another one of those. I just like, oh, my sweet prince.
When Modern Horizons 2 was spoiled, one of the cards that I was sure was going to be an absolute bomb upon reading it was Fey Offering. It's 2 and a green for an enchantment. At the beginning of each end step, if you've cast both a creature spell and a non-creature spell, create a clue token, a food token, and a treasure token. That is a crazy amount of reward for just doing the thing that your deck was probably doing. The problem is none of my decks do that thing. You need to have and it's similar to Amnata's Augury. You just need to have the right mix of things in your deck to consistently trigger it. And I don't have any decks that have that consistent mix of things. Even if you ignore the fact that like it's pretty tricky to trigger on everyone's turn, since you need to, be able to cast creatures with flash or something. Even just doing it on your turn, casting both a creature spell and a non-creature spell really requires a mix of things that just tends to not naturally pop up in my decks. You have to probably want to have a lot of low-cost creatures, maybe an elf deck or something, but those decks tend to run a gazillion creatures, not a lot of other spells that you're going to be regularly casting.
Yeah.
Even that kind of deck tends to not run a ton of Nature's War style ramp because so many elves tap for green mana as well. So I've just never quite found a deck that has the right mix of cards in the list that's going to make Fey Offering worth running. It was one of those cards that when I first saw it, I was like, I can't believe they printed that. And then I tried to figure out how to make it work. And I was like, oh, that's just because there's not a lot of decks that naturally give you the mix of things that allow you to use it consistently enough to justify a slot. And I'm sure there's decks that do it, and I will I'm always looking for one, but I just haven't quite found that mix yet.
Yeah, there's just so much value stapled to this, and I really like it. But yeah, there's so many hoops, and it's oftentimes when you get really specific with all the considerations you have to keep in mind when putting a card into your decks, like both the cards you already talked about, Fey Offering and Amanatu's Augury, they require you to kind of get specific with how you're constructing your deck to really get a good balance and don't let you favor a certain card type over the other. And so, yeah, I can see why this would be frustrating to not be able to put into just any deck, much less a deck.
I do think that with all of the new obs on food token stuff, that probably can give this card a bit of new life, maybe? So, like, that is good. But also, those new obs on food token decks, those are too mainstream for Dana to build. So he's
that
not
is
gonna...
true.
But here, I do have the perfect story with Fey Offering. Like, because I did put this into a deck that cared a lot about artifact tokens. I was just like, I had a Mazarek deck built for a while, so sacrificing all those artifact tokens was going to give me a lot of +1 counters. And honestly, y'all, there is nothing better than riding the high of casting both Fey Offering and Academy Manufactor on the same turn.
I was thinking that, but I didn't want to scare Dana with popular cards.
Sure.
So then you make 3 clues and 3 food and 3 treasures, and it is, even if you don't trigger Fey Offering again for the rest of the game, you don't care, because you got exactly what you
Sure,
like.
right.
So like that is a highlight, but also that was not easy to pull off in that deck, and it's very difficult to make those stars align. And even Academy Manufactor is one of those. I'm just like, ooh, I want to find more decks for that too, but I don't make clues all that often, and I don't have too many things that make treasures, so like, gotta be careful with it too. But like, yeah, this is a really good pick. I love this card.
I mean, I feel like somebody should just like challenge how many decks are playing Fey Offering with Academy Manufactor. If only there was a segment of a podcast that could tell people, hey, if you're playing this card, you might want to play this card, or you might not want to play that card. If only there was like a way for people to be told that you shouldn't always do that, or you should do that.
Matt, that segue was so ham-fisted it might as well be a food token. Come on, man.
And then you're also going to make a treasure and also a clue, so that's fine. I'm getting all my value. Call me Fey Offering.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, all right. If you insist, yes, I suppose that we can challenge some of the stats here on the EDHREC, even despite that ridiculous stolen segue. Yeah, folks, we'll be right back after this break. Alrighty, I will start us off this week with an Overplayed challenge, and the reason that I want to mention this one is because there's an upcoming precon in the Commander Masters affiliated products that is led by Julodoc Void Gorger. It's going to be a colorless deck, and that's one of the first times I think we've ever gotten a colorless precon, which is really, really interesting. And so I want to revisit a card that I think we challenged probably just years upon years ago, but there are some cards that show up in colorless decks that I don't really think should. For example, in the deck Kozilek the Great Distortion, which has more than 6,000 decks in the EDHREC database, that's a colorless commander that currently is playing Myriad Landscape at a clip of 20%. So a fifth of Kozilek decks are playing Myriad Landscape, and actually 6% of Kozilek decks are playing Arcane Signet. And both of these should not happen. Both of those should be 0, because those cards do not work in that deck. Myriad Landscape, you can tap 2 mana, tap it, and sacrifice it, and search your library for up to 2 basic land cards that share a land type, put them onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. And in a colorless deck, you'll have wastes, but wastes don't have a land type. They are just lands. They're just basic lands, but they don't have a land type like forest or like mountain or anything like that. So Myriad Landscape would not be able to fetch wastes. And Arcane Signet can tap to add 1 mana of any color in your commander's color identity, but a colorless deck isn't going to have any color in your commander's color identity, so it will do nothing. It will be a 2 mana artifact that does not do anything. So if you are interested in playing that new Julodoc or whatever other commander happens to be in that precon as well, if you're going to start doing some colorless stuff, just pay very careful attention to the wording of some of these traditional staple cards, because stuff like Myriad Landscape, stuff like Arcane Signet do not work when your commander does not have color identity, or you don't have any of those lands that actually have land types in your deck. So fair warning, these cards are overplayed.
So my challenge this week, actually, going into this episode, I was thinking, well, actually, this card actually is probably a little bit overplayed in these certain decks. But then after WotC effectively made the mechanic on the card work differently with this most recent Lord of the Rings precons, I actually now I'm going to say that this card is underplayed in some of its most popular commanders. So Dreadhorde Invasion is the card that I'm going to challenge this week. It is 1 and a black for an enchantment that says at the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life and you amass zombies 1. Now, that's very important to point out because the card itself says amass 1, but actually the errata, the oracle text of the card now says amass zombies 1. So when Wizards of the Coast started printing these Lord of the Rings precons and being able to enable you to amass orcs 1, they changed the way that amass works. So it used to be that if you didn't have an army, you would create a 0/1 zombie army, and then you would just amass onto that army. But now that you can amass orc armies, they changed the way that it works. So if you amass onto an army that exists already, you then give it that creature type that you are amassing. So say you have a zombie army out, and then you have, I don't know, Sauron the Dark Lord that amasses orcs 1 whenever an opponent casts a spell. You then amass onto that same army you already have, which also then gives it the orc creature type. So then you have a orc zombie army. And if you amass onto a changeling, for example, you have a every creature type army. But basically they changed the way that amass works. And that's the important part, because with both of the two most common commanders for Dreadhorde Invasion, Sauron the Dark Lord, and Saruman the White Hand, which make a ton of orc armies. Because of the way that they changed how Amass works, the second ability on Dreadhorde Invasion, which kind of used to be a throwaway, now is super duper relevant. So whenever a zombie token you control with power 6 or greater attacks, it gains lifelink until end of turn. That's very important because, you know, if you have an army that's chilling out there, it's a 10-10, but it's getting chump blocked to death, you can use Dreadhorde Invasion to amass onto that, make it a zombie, and then you're going to attack with it, and you're going to get that second ability right away, and you're going to start gaining life. You can have a pre-built army, and it's just going to start going to town. At first, I thought, okay, you have to have a specific zombie army, which doesn't work with Dreadhorde Invasion. 46% of decks with Sauron the Dark Lord, that just seems too high. It's not really going to get you what you're never going to get that second ability. But now that they changed the way that Amass works, you are going to get that ability all the time, and it's so good. The numbers probably should be matching Marher or Uruk-hai Captain, which 73% of those decks are playing Dreadhorde Invasion. I think if you're playing any sort of commander that can amass any sort of army token as easily as Sauron the Dark Lord, Saruman the White Hand, you definitely want Dreadhorde Invasion. It's not even $1. It's a super cheap pickup. You're going to get so much value out of this card now because they did change the way that Amass works. Folks, they changed the way that the stupid card works. You need to be playing it more.
Sauron is saying whenever an opponent casts a spell, amass orcs 1. Like, we've all played with Forgotten Ancient, right? We've all played with Mana Gorger Hydra. We've seen how big those things get whenever an opponent casts a spell. I've got an Ishai deck, and that one's like, oh, I got a plus 1 counter whenever an opponent casts a spell. That thing gets huge so fast. So for Sauron to be like, oh, here's the orcs that are going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then you can give them a bunch of other, like, you can just Katamari the orcs into also being zombie army, and then give them other keywords. Like, oh man. Whew.
It's wild, all the value. So I had a Saruman the White Hand out, and I cast a Spell Swindle. And you know what's really cool when you Spell Swindle something and you get 5 tokens is when you also get a 5/5 creature with it. It is so silly. And so like it's so easy to make massive armies with Amass these days. And Dreadhorde Invasion, it's just going to make those armies even better. Sign me up for only 2 mana. That's such a great value.
Yeah, I love that the throwaway text on that card is actually going to become super relevant with all the new orc stuff.
They changed the way the card works. They changed the way the card works.
All right, Dana, what's your challenge? Did any cards change in the way that they worked?
It was nothing that changed. The challenge this week, though, is also from Lord of the Rings. It's from a listener, Alta Biscuit. It says, with a lot of commanders from Lord of the Rings looking to take advantage of the ring tempts you mechanic, there's a lot of chances to look at what overlooked synergies come from that mechanic. The second stage of the ring makes you draw a card and discard a card when your Ringbearer attacks, so you can easily trigger effects that go off when you draw your second card per turn, because obviously you draw one during your draw step, or things that trigger when you discard a card. And people maybe aren't synergizing with that as much as they should be. 2 of the examples that Ultimus sent us here are Ironcrag Pyromancer. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, it deals 3 damage to any target. So it just gives you a free lightning bolt if it's out, because you're going to be in that deck having a Ringbearer very, very frequently. Containment Construct is another one. Whenever you discard a card, you may exile that card from your graveyard, and if you do, you may play that card this turn. So whatever card you discard, you can just reuse it if you want to. I do think that's a really good point. There's a lot of things that you can do with the ring tempts you mechanic, but the second synergies that people are missing out on with these, it's not just the bonuses it gives you, but it's like, how can you take additional advantage of that card draw, that discard, that kind of thing. And right now, looking at decks, Containment Constructs in just 86 of just under 4,000 Sauron the Dark Lord decks, and it's in less than 5 decks of the other Ringbearer commanders, and Ironcrag Pyromancer is in only 5 Sauron decks as well. So yeah, if you're playing Sauron, or if you're playing anything that's built around that mechanic, there's a lot of ways you can take advantage of that guaranteed second card draw per turn, or that discard per turn, and people really aren't doing that yet.
Yeah, the draw 2 cards, draw a second card. There's a lot of potential in there. Like Gixian Puppeteer could be another. Whenever you draw your second card, each opponent loses 2 and you gain 2. Joel Rael, Empress of beasts, or not her, Jolrael Monvoli Recluse, sorry. She makes cat tokens and can also pump your stuff up. Like, there's a lot of potential to look into there. I love that.
Yeah, that's a good find. And you know, a lot of that's probably because people are relatively new to those decks. They haven't gotten a chance to experience that synergy yet and like see, oh, I could take advantage of that. But absolutely, if you are playing those decks, get ahead of the curve, and I think people will start running more and more of those cards as those decks mature in the database.
Nice stuff. Cool pick. I love that. All right, let's get back into our main topic here, talking about some cards that we wish we could play them just a little bit more if we had a deck to actually put these. Matt, what's your next selection?
So my next card is one that I know Dana has had some good success with it. I just don't. I've tried to put it into decks, and it's never. Every time I've dug into, okay, is my deck built to take advantage of this? It's never really worked out. So Symmetry Matrix is a card that, in theory, it should go on a lot of my decks because I play a lot of creatures in pretty much all of my decks. But it never works. I look at the creatures that I'm playing in my decks, and maybe half, not even, more often than not, are going to be able to trigger it. So Symmetry Matrix is 4 mana for an artifact that says, whenever a creature with power equal to its toughness enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay 1. If you do, draw a card. I've had so many cards, but like when you look at all the creatures that, even the most popular creatures that are played in the format, you have stuff like Reclamation Sage, you have stuff like Eternal Witness, you have a whole bunch of just all these creatures. So many of them don't have power equal to the toughness, and that's just what throws it off for me. I just don't have a deck for it. But also, I think I can kind of just say Brothers War as a whole set. Do you remember Brothers War, everyone?
20 sets ago. It was so long ago, Matt, I just don't.
It was so long ago. I feel bad because I don't remember a set that I was so excited to have come out and then almost forgot about.
Dang.
It immediately just got pushed out by all the things going on immediately after it. Because we got the revisit to Phyrexia and all the things that went on. Those are two of the most juiciest sets for Commander players maybe of all time. And so Brothers War just in general got pushed out, but I especially wish I had a home for Symmetry Matrix.
Yeah, that's a cool effect. I feel like it really wants you to be in a token deck to work, like you're making a bunch of 1/1s or a bunch of 2/2s. Mm-hmm. But like Matt, even in your decks that make tokens, like your Raga Draga deck, you're making Eldrazi Spawn tokens, which are 0/1s, so you're still not triggering this.
Yeah, I make 1/1s as well, but most of them aren't. And so it's really hard. I have so many decks that in theory would love it, but it just doesn't work when I actually look at the disbursement of what kind of creatures I'm making.
Yeah, the problem with Symmetry Matrix is it's asking for two things. It wants creatures to come into play regularly on your turn that have an equal power and toughness. Token decks do that oftentimes, but not always, as Matt just told us. His doesn't really do that. But not only do you need to be able to consistently make creatures that come into play that have an equal power and toughness, you have to have a deck that also has mana free to take advantage of it.
Right.
And being, a 1 mana to draw cards a pretty good rate of return, but that can throw off the tempo of what your deck's trying to do as well. A lot of times you kind of know how your mana is going to get spent and you have a plan for that, and tacking 1 mana onto that, even for something as amazing as drawing a card that you can't go back from, you can't change your mind about. It may cost you 3 mana to draw a card off a War Room or something, but you can do that at the end of the turn.
Right.
Before you untap, after you've determined you don't need to use the mana for something else. Symmetry Matrix, you have to use it immediately. So while I have found decks, I have this in 2 decks currently, again, it's a situation where like, those 2 decks just happen to work really well with it, and I totally understand how there's a lot of decks that don't. Lifecrafter's Bestiary is a very similar card,
yeah.
And the problem with Bestiary was it required a green mana to get the card draw, and that was an even bigger ask. It wasn't just that you had to spend a mana in tax shelf to draw a card. It had to be a very specific color mana, and that always threw me off.
And I think especially with a lot of, like, if you are playing a green deck, you've got so many options you've got your Return of the Wild Speakers, you've got so much stuff that you can do.
Yeah.
Your Beast Whisperers and all that. If you're like, I've got a token deck where I'm like, I took a look at Symmetry Matrix from my Thalys deck because I'm making a ton of tokens there. I could really have a heyday if I wanted to draw cards. But the thing is that a card like Pact of the Serpent would draw me more cards. I have a lot of options. Even just a regular Read the Bones, I'm just like, this is going to be a little bit more consistent, and that will help me out. There are, or Minions Murmurs. That's another one. Draw cards equal to the number of creatures that you control, and you lose life for it. But I'm just like, I know this is going to draw me definitely something, and I don't have to worry about the timing of it or paying too much extra mana for it. And those have sort of just eked out a little bit over time of like, yeah, I think I do kind of prefer those. This one, I think it does really require, probably, I think it gets a little bit more relegated to mono white because of just the options that other colors will sometimes have for a strategy like tokens or a very creature dense strategy. They're going to have other stuff that they can do instead. So either mono white, mono red. I don't know if Boros will want it. Maybe. I feel like Boros is usually doing some other stuff with equipmenty things. I don't know. But yeah, it just feels like color wise, this is secretly like a mono white card or something.
And it's got kind of a lot of parallels to Mentor the Meek too. And so there's a lot of immediate lines that you can draw. I see why you would say that, Joey.
And I will note one of the decks from running it is a mono white deck, so you're not wrong. Like that's absolutely one of the places where I'm using it.
And I like you said, Dana, if I had a deck that more reliably made tokens that were all the same type all the time, I think that would give it a little bit more juice, a little more leeway. I toyed with it in my Kyler deck because that's probably the closest I get to having a bunch of creatures that all have the same power and toughness when they come in. But even then, I was like, well, we'll see. It's going to be some tinkering for sure.
All right, Dana, you're up next.
The card I want to talk about next is a card that I was really hyped on at release, and was sure it was going to be the kind of card I was going to wind up putting in a whole bunch of decks, and I've just never had the right one for it, and that's Path of Discovery. I remember thinking it was going to kind of be Green's version of Cathar's Crusade, maybe. It's 3 and a green for an enchantment. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, it explores. So you reveal the top card of your library and put that card into your hand if it's a land, or you put a +1 counter on the creature and put the card back or put it into your graveyard. So it lets you do a little bit of, filtering down in your library. It lets you buff up a creature. If you have a bunch of creatures coming into play simultaneously, probably from tokens or something, you can just put that card back and make sure everything comes into play with a +1 counter on it. There's a lot of nice little synergies with it, particularly because it's not on cast, it's an ETB. So if you're blinking stuff or putting a ton of tokens into play, you can get a ton of triggers on this. But I just never found the deck that wants those particular triggers, that wants to put just a single +1 counter on a bunch of tokens and wants to have the explore effect. I just can't quite find that mix of things that does what I want to make this card work, despite the fact that every time I make a green deck, I'm like, okay, is this the deck for Path of Discovery? And it's never quite there. I can never quite unlock it.
So I really enjoy Path of Discovery. I have a copy in my Ukima and Kazir deck, which is all about +1/+1 counters and being able to get a little bit of the card manipulation going, controlling what's on the top of my deck, filtering stuff down, like you said, Dana, and also getting +1/+1 counters, getting something on everything to get that party started, because I found that the deck, it struggles to get that first counter on. But once one is there, I can proliferate and build upon that. And so Path of Discovery does a lot of things. It's one of those cards, it doesn't do anything great, but it does a lot of little things really well. And if you're able to trigger the Explorer ability on it, and you're able to kind of filter down, if you have any graveyard synergies in your deck, Joseph, then you're going to be able to really fill up your graveyard pretty quick if you were trying to.
I think this card suffers a little bit from something that actually I also have an issue with on the next card that I wanted to mention here. But this card feels to me like it has so many moving parts, and in Commander decks, we want every single ingredient on a card to be relevant to everything that deck is doing. It very much feels like if there's a part, if you weren't able to use the +1 counters in the way that you said, Matt, if you didn't have proliferate effects or other stuff to make those +1 counters relevant, and it was just you're playing this in a tokens deck, it feels like you're missing out on some cool aspect of the synergy that this card could offer you. And so that's one of the things that mentally makes it easier to cut from a deck. And I feel similarly about the next card here, which also has to do with +1 counters. I wish that I played Lux Artillery more. I wish I had a deck to put Lux Artillery into. This is also a 4-mana card that cares about +1 counters. Whenever you cast an artifact creature spell, it gains Sunburst, so it'll enter the battlefield with counters on it for each color of mana that you spent to cast it. And at the beginning of your end step, and this text is so delicious, if there are 30 or more counters among artifacts and creatures you control, Lux Artillery deals 10 damage to each opponent. Just just so cool, just awesome. And so I've got a +1 counters deck, but it doesn't have any artifact creatures in it. I'm just like, oh, I'm never getting that first paragraph of that text. So for that reason, I look at Lux Artillery and I'm like, well, I'd literally be missing out on half of the words of this card. So mentally, it's easier for me to cut that. Just like for this card here that y'all are talking about, like when you're exploring, if you're not able to use those +1 counters and it's just regularly a token deck, you'd kind of be missing out on some of the benefit aside from just, oh, the creatures are a little bit bigger. And so I feel like it's one of those where I'm just like, I really need to have a lot more stars align for the deck to actually line up exactly with what all of the ingredients of this card are trying to do. And that's why I look at these and I'm just like, I wish.
So as somebody who plays a lot of Lux in League of Legends, like nearly 1 million mastery points Lux levels of I've played that many games, I also really wanted to play Lux Artillery because that's pretty much what the character Lux does in League of Legends. I get the struggle, Joey. I've wanted to put this in a deck. I don't really have a good place for it. Ukeem Kazur's the closest, but like if something has 30 more counters,
you're just winning a different way, right?
Yeah, I can just flicker Ukima once and kill everybody. So, I don't really need Lux Artillery. It's a win more card in that deck, and everything else is a do nothing card. So I get the struggle, Joey. I love this card. It's super cool. It does a lot of really cool things, but I just don't have a home for it.
And that's why for this card, I would want to have it, because it just counts counters among artifacts and creatures you control, not just +1 counters. So I would want this to be in a deck that has a lot of counters on artifacts, which I just don't happen to have. But that's the way I can actually use all of the ingredients on this card. And it just hasn't quite lined up yet. And so, yeah, these 4 mana cards that are putting +1 counters on things, it's hard to justify them, but man, are they just fun to think about and brainstorm about. And we want to put them somewhere.
So the one thing about Lux Artillery I will note that's probably a little bit different than most of the rest of the cards we talked about is almost all the rest of them have been like, well, it might work in this kind of token deck if you were doing this or that, but I just don't have that deck. Lux Artillery, if you are playing a modular deck, it's going to be, in fact, like every single time, it's amazing. So like if you are playing, because almost every modular deck is going to be at least 2 colors, probably Boros. So your modular creatures are going to all come into play with 2 extra counters on them. Those counters are going to move around and, have a lot of different ways to stay in play too, to make it easier to hit that threshold. It's a perfect card for modular decks and probably not really for any other deck. Right. So as someone who has a budget Boros modular deck, the card is amazing in there. And other than that, it's one of those cards where I look at and go, is it gonna work there? No, not really. Like it has a really specific home, and if there's another one out there for it, I have not managed to find it yet.
That's just the thing, isn't it? So many cards, so many commanders that come out these days. We had a whole episode about how like they're very hyper specialized, but I feel like a lot of the cards that go into the 99 are also very hyper specialized. And the thing that I keep running into is that I want to take those hyper specialized cards out of those specific decks and put them somewhere else, and it still doesn't quite line up. But I'm just like, but I want a deck for you. But it's just like, all right, then build a hyper specialized deck for me. And I'm like, yeah, but I don't want to play modular. Yeah. And then it's just like, well, I don't know what you expected. This is exactly where I want to go. Like,
right. Yeah. Well, like talking about hyper specialized, well, the next card here on my list is Twinning Staff.
Yeah.
3 mana. If you would copy a spell 1 or more times and said copy it that many times plus an additional time, and you could choose new targets for the additional copy. That's amazing. Assuming you're copying a bunch of spells, and you have to be copying a bunch of spells. It's not the kind of thing where, like, if you have a couple of spell copy things in your deck, it's probably almost never going to be worth having it, just for a couple occasional copies. You need to have a big density of spell copy effects. And if you have a big density of spell copy effects, the thing you're doing is probably so explosive that like adding 1 more copy on an artifact that's sitting in play probably isn't the kind of thing that you need to worry about too much. At least that's been the thing for me. This is one of those cards where I saw it, I'm like, oh, this is so powerful. And then after looking at it and like thinking about it, I'm like, yeah, it's super powerful, but I can't quite find that right mix of things that makes it worth running.
Yeah, this card really does feel like I feel like the place it ends up most of the time is like in a deck where the commander is doing the copying for you, like Anhelo the Painter, like Volo, the Simic Guide to Monsters, Ivy Gleeful Spell Thief. Those are very straightforward places to put it. The problem, Dana, is that that's not what you want to do. You don't want it to just be handed to you on a plate. You want to be like, no, I've got a lot of copy stuff within the 99. And it's just like, yeah, but that's harder. Like, it's harder to build a whole deck where you're doing enough copying within the 99 and not right there from the command zone that would justify this this card being in your deck.
Yes.
And it's just because we love jumping all these hurdles and making these stuff harder for us. But like, yeah, you don't want to just build a Volo deck that would make this card really easy to actually just slot right in. So I get it.
Well, it's funny that we talked about how Magic players love a challenge a couple weeks ago.
Love a challenge the stats.
Yeah, that too. But I want to make an addendum to that. Magic players love making the game harder for themselves than it needs to be. Kind of like they make the game more expensive for themselves than it needs to be. Like I can because players are like, I want to get the most blingiest version. I'm like, you can just get a regular basic land. That's fine. You have a million laying around. But same way. So Magic players love finding like a card they want to build around. And I'm the most guilty of this because you've heard the cards I've talked about so far. And they're like, I'm going to make a whole deck around this. And it's going to be the worst, just like pile. And you're going to look at me like, what's your problem? So a card that, I don't know if it's a pile, but I want to put into a deck anyways. And this actually, one of my best friends reminded me this card exists. And I was like, oh yeah, I wanted this. Like, yeah, this card is kind of you. Life of the Party does a lot of really fun things. And I wish that any of them could fit into a deck that I have. So Life of the Party, 3 in a red for a elemental creature. It's a 0/1 with first strike, trample, and haste. That's not very good, is it? Nope, because there's more text. So whenever Life of the Party attacks, it gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is the number of creatures you control. And then when Life of the Party enters the battlefield, if it's not a token, each opponent creates a token that's a copy of it, and the tokens are goaded for the rest of the game. Now, say what you will about Goad. Dana, I know you have some thoughts on Goad as mechanic. I think this is the perfect execution of Goad because you're giving your opponents this big beefy creature and just letting them just like go to town. It's not stopping. It's not like locking people out. It's just encouraging a little controlled chaos. And also, I like to put creatures on the battlefield. And so Life of the Party for me is always going to be enormous. So this does so many fun things that I like to do in my typical Magic game. But I've never found a home for it, and I feel like that's a problem that is mine to solve, but I also don't know how to solve it.
Oh, Matt. Yeah, when you said lets people go to town, they really do get to go to town.
Goad the whole town.
Yeah, this is one that I have also toyed with I have that Goad deck, that Karazakar deck, and I, historically with that deck, have not had enough creatures for my own benefit off of this card to feel really great, because it gets that pump equal to the number of creatures you control, and I'm just like, I've got Karazakar and like a 6/6 over here. I've got some big beefy creatures, and I'm like, do I change this more into a tokeny type of deck to make better use of cards like this? But honestly, the place that I would want to see a Life of the Party is in a blink deck. Just blink it over and over again and give your opponents a bunch of copies of this. Like that's my so little chaos moment with this card. That's what I want to do with it.
And it's not like it's abusing Goad as a mechanic, and it's not locking your opponents down. You're giving them something, and that is the only goaded creature they have. I mean, more than likely. But yes, like Goad, and again, Dan, I know that you have thoughts, but this is, to me, it's like a perfect little balance of like, it's a fun mechanic and it's going to play around with it, but it's not going to do anything that's going to totally just make the game unfun to play against.
Yeah, but it's one of those things too, where like I like, actually, I tend to agree with you. It's a good implementation of it, but finding the right spot for it, right, is tricky. And yeah, it's a card that I've considered for decks too, and I just can't find anything that quite works in a way that I want it in my deck and can justify a slot other than like just forcing it.
Yeah, I feel that. All right, I'll go to my next one here. And Matt, I think maybe you'll appreciate this because I know that you liked the Warhammer 40k pre-constructed decks. And in one of those decks, there was the card Genestealer Patriarch. And I mean, I really like this thing, and I'm like, why do I not have a deck that is suitable to play this? Genestealer Patriarch, which would be a great drag name. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage, Genestealer Patriarch. 5 mana, 4/4 Tyrannid, and it has the ability, whenever it attacks, you put an infection counter on a creature that a defending player controls, and whenever a creature with an infection counter on it dies, you create a token that is a copy of that creature, except is also a Tyrannid in addition to its other types. That sounds so cool to me. It's a 5 mana 4/4, so on rate, it's not great. And again, to use all of the ingredients of this card, I think I would need to have like other token synergies in a deck that plays this, or other copy synergies in a deck that plays this, or even the ability to make extra tokens and extra counters and move those counters around, or something like that. Like, I don't know. There's something else that I would need for this card to really, really be able to shine in a deck. But man, do I want to play it, because I want to make copies of other people's creatures real bad. fun.
I really like what this card is trying to do, but the fact that, like you said, Joey, it's a 4/4 for 5. It has to attack first, and then the other creature has to die while the Patriarch is still on the battlefield. So there's a lot of things that need to go right in order to get value out of this. And again, it's a fun card, but how many hoops do you want to put yourself through before this card gets good? Again, we like to make the game harder than it needs to be to get cool things. And Genestealer Patriarch, it does a lot of fun things, but is it worth all the hoops that you have to go through in order to get the fun?
Yeah, exactly. I look at this card and I'm just like, man, this is another prince, another sweet prince. But like, even if it had a different creature type that I could justify, like, I can put this into a deck that cares a lot about sphinxes or whatever. I'm just like, I really, or if I had more tokeny things, there's a lot of stuff I would love to do with this, but it just like, I need one more of those things to line up with what my decks are currently doing, which is why I haven't been able to justify playing it. But the next time I build a blue deck, this card's in the considerations pile before I even know what the commander is, because I just really like it.
The one that I'm always looking at in a deck, in what's frustrating about it is I know exactly multiple decks where it would be fantastic. And that's Lijara Mirror Lake. It's a land, it comes into play tapped, but it does tap for blue mana, so that's kind of nice. And you can spend 5 mana total, 2 green and a blue to tap it and sacrifice it, and you can make a token that's a copy of target creature you control, except for it comes into play with an extra +1 counter on it, and you can activate that only as a sorcery. It's basically like a land that's going to come into play tapped, and if you never use it, there's really, you've taken a small tempo hit, but like there's not a lot of downside to that. That's a pretty big upside, being able to make a copy of a creature you control. Except for you have to probably be playing it in a Simic deck that has a creature that's worth copying. Mm-hmm. And so many Simic decks tend to like go that value train, or, in my case, the one Simic deck I have is Edric's Fundmaster of Trest. Well, I'm not going to copy some 1/1 flyer. Like, that doesn't do me any good. So if you're playing Miriam Sentinel Worm right now, you're like listening and be like, what are you talking about? I got a gazillion dragons that are awesome to copy. And it's magnificent in that deck because you're playing dragons and access to green and blue. And, any 5-color deck is probably worth looking at. But I don't have anything that's featuring green and blue that has creatures worth copying, unfortunately. And I really want to do that because I like this card a lot, but I just have no home for it.
Dana, with these Kaldheim utility lands,
for real.
You talked about Port of Carfil before. Like,
yep.
You just love these cards.
I'm a big fan of a bunch of them. I do.
They are very good. They have a lot of effects that just, if you're playing those colors, there's not really any harm in just slotting these in. Don't cut a basic for it. Don't do what Dana does.
Or do. That's fine.
No, Dana. Oh, man. Dana, this card reminds me a lot of Mirror Pool, which is a colorless land that has an effect to copy an instant or sorcery spell, which would be great for twinning stuff. And it can make a token that's a copy of a creature you control. I feel like, are you playing Mirror Pool anywhere?
I would say that the difference worth noting here is, particularly like if you're looking at a 5-color deck or something, that colorless mana cost hurts you a lot more than the blue, the being able to tap this for blue.
Yeah.
So like if you're playing a 2-color deck, I think then I understand if you want one, probably want both. But I think this slots much more easily into a 3 or a 4 or a 5-color deck than does Mirror Pool.
Well, I was just going to say, I'm just like, I have looked at Mirror Pool as another card where I'm like, man, I wish I played that more often. But that colorless requirement and the fact that it enters tapped and doesn't fix colors, that's kept it out of a lot of my own decks.
Yeah.
So like even that one I can't really justify, let alone the other one. So I'm wondering if like, here's yet another one of those lands where it's just like, it seems like these cards are sisters and we're just like, man, like get into a deck, but we can't really justify it still. It's just
right.
Like, I wish I could.
Yeah. The deck building cost of Mirror Pool is very, very steep. I have it in one deck, and even then I feel like that's too many. And I love the card. It's so good, but you need a good density of colorless producing lands. And I don't think a lot of decks are really keeping that in mind when they're putting cards like Mirror Pool in there. Like they might be putting a few in there, but making sure you have the density to meet what Mirror Pool needs you to be doing, it's really hard.
Especially if you're in a lot of colors.
Well, before we wrap up, I want to shout out. So I haven't talked about any green cards this episode, and I believe in my contract I have to. So a couple cards I do want to shout out that just I like them. I like what they're doing in theory, but I don't have any homes for them. Not because of the colors, obviously, but because just what the cards require you to be doing. So Venerated Rot Priest, I know a lot of people got real upset when this card was printed because it's dealing with poison counters. So Venerated Rot Priest, 1 mana for a 1/2 Phyrexian Druid with Toxic 1. But whenever a creature you control becomes the target of a spell, target opponent gets a poison counter. This is really cool, and I love one of my very, very first 60-card casual decks that was just a pile was a heroic deck. So I always, like, my heartstrings always have this affinity towards heroic spells and that mechanic in general. Venerated Rot Priest does a lot of things that I would love to be doing in that deck. And so this, and a special shout out, I guess, to Season of Growth, because both of them have a ton of potential, a ton of value, but I just don't have, I don't have any decks anymore in Commander, especially, that are targeting my own things, that are pumping them up or doing whatever. I know there's a lot of decks out there. I know the new Legolas Commander, all about targeting itself. And there's just so many cool things. I love pumping up. I love combat tricks. I just love combat tricks. And Venerated Rot Priest, Season of Growth, both of these cards absolutely love enabling combat tricks. I just don't have a home for them. And they would kind of maybe fit in my Ukim and Khazir deck, but I'm not really pumping out a bunch of spells. It's more like moving +1/+1 counters around. I'm not targeting with spells really in that deck. And so I wish I had a home for types of cards like these two. I just don't currently have that spot.
I mean, it sounds like you just need to build that Legolas deck, and those would both go in there?
Apparently, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, Matt, you said that you were contractually obligated to talk about at least some green cards, and it occurs to me that I've named like some blue and some red and stuff, but I don't think I've mentioned a black card. So I have to fulfill my part of the
Your time to shine, Joey. Your time.
I'll shout out Tormod the Desecrator here. This is a card that I keep on. I'm just like, why isn't this card fitting the way I think it should fit into? I do so many graveyard things, and yet this card has not actually fit into any one of them. So I'm like, I need to build a new graveyard deck where Tormod the Desecrator can actually do the things I want it to do, because the potential in this card looks off the chain. It is a 4 mana 4/2 zombie wizard. Whenever one or more cards leave your graveyard, you create a tapped 2/2 black zombie creature token. Y'all know I have so many graveyard decks. I've got Mimeoplasm, I've got Sir Conrad, I've got Vohar, I've got Babalasar. I am doing so many things with the graveyard. And this thing, the problem with Tormod is that it wants cards to leave your graveyard one at a time. And I don't do that. I have cards leave my graveyard en masse. I am living death deck kind of person. Like, that is the thing that I do. So Tormod has never actually gotten to do anything in those decks. I keep trying to justify it, but no, I would make one zombie at most, and the deck would be very uninterested in doing a couple of little bit of recursion things the way that Tormod is asking you to. So I'm like, you might just need to build a Legolas deck. I'm over here like, do I just need to build a Tormod deck to finally get what I want this card to do? I feel like it should go in the 99, but it might just need to end up being one of my future commanders.
Yeah, I mean, here we are just brewing decks on our own, just in real time for everyone to hear.
There you go. Dana, what are you contractually obligated to talk about?
I mean, I think I've gone through a little bit of it, but I guess I haven't brought up a weird old card yet. That's usually, I guess what I do. So the one I will throw out here would be War Cadence.
That fits the bill right there. Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
A War Cadence is a old enchantment from Arcadian Masks, 2 in a red, and you can spend X in a red, and this turn creatures can't block unless their controller pays X for each blocking creature he or she controls. So for one, you can, obviously use it on your turn to make your stuff more or less unblockable, depending on how many creatures are coming in and how much mana your opponent has. But you can use it on anybody else's turn too. It's one of those cards where, like, if someone's attacking one of your opponents and you want to make that thing nearly unblockable, you can pump a few mana into it and do that. I think that's a super useful card, but it's one of those cards where it's super useful in kind of a generic sense. And I don't have a deck that's really crying out for the ability to just make stuff unblockable, either because, my red decks have creatures that have some form of evasion already, or they're not things that I'm super concerned about poking damage through because, they're not attacking very regularly. I don't know what it is, but I love War Cadence. It's one of those cards that the first time I saw it, I was sure I was going to be putting it in a bunch of decks. And again, I just don't have any decks that are crying out for that particular effect.
See, I like this card in the same way I like a certain other card that kind of does the same thing that I have in my Valduk deck, Invasion Plans. It's the only deck that I have space for it, but Invasion Plans is very much the same way. So all creatures block each combat if able, and the attacking player chooses how each creature blocks each combat. It's just such a fun way to really mess up the people who want to pillow fort up and I have all these chump blockers. Well, that doesn't matter because I get to pick how you block, or I get to make you pay a bunch of mana in order to block.
Fun for you. You said it's fun.
Right.
Fun for you, Matt. You keep killing off my stuff.
It is
You keep
fun.
on making my stuff block.
I don't care about your fun. I want my fun.
Well, Dothy Embrace is a similar one as well. 2 and a black, and you can spend double black and give a creature shadow until end of turn. So again, make it pretty much unblockable. And you can also target your opponent's stuff with that. It's just, again, one of those cards that I like it a lot and always want to find a home for it. But any of the decks I have, again, I'm like, it's a Golgari deck, so I've got a bunch of trample on stuff. I don't really need to give it shadow. Or, I have a dragon deck in Dimir. Well, dragon's all flying, so I need it way less there as well. It's just one of those cards similarly.
Yeah.
I like it a lot, and none of my decks need that ability necessarily.
Yeah, Doubt the Embrace is so cool. I've got that in one deck, and every time I see it, I'm just like, tee-hee-hee, I'm going to become a little gremlin. It's awesome. But the War Cadence, the War Cadence especially, I'm looking at that card and genuinely I would actually see that card. If you did play that card in a deck, I would actually be kind of terrified of it in the subtlest of ways, not in an overt horror movie way, but in a psychological thriller kind of way. Because if I ever tap out,
right,
then all you have to do is pay 2 mana. And it's you don't have 1 mana to block with any of your creatures, so good luck. That is doing a lot of work. And so I hope you do find a place for it, because that seems the effect mentally that will have on me in the game is don't tap out. Sure. Don't turn off the light. Don't go to sleep. Don't tap out. That's the effect that the card will have on me, like a horror movie. All right, guys, now that we have finally fulfilled our contractual obligations, Matt's talked about green, I've talked about black, Dana's talked about old cards. Now I think we can finally move to start wrapping things up. But I don't know, before we go, are there any other final thoughts that we have about this topic, about these cards that we wish we played more, that we had a deck for? Are there any other final things that you want to throw out there?
Yeah, I would say don't give up looking for a home for these cards, particularly for someone who brews decks all the time. Don't you couldn't find a home for your deck, so you quit looking, because you might find yourself just brewing a deck where things accidentally work out. One thing that came up for me, Spell Swindle is a super cool card. It's a 5 mana counter spell, and you create X colorless treasure artifact tokens, where X is that spell's mana cost. So it's kind of a mana drain that's making you treasures. Mana drain's obviously super efficient at 2 mana. This costs 5, but I've always wanted a deck for Spell Swindle, and it's not it's ever a bad card, but I felt I wanted to have it in a deck where I was getting some synergy, but I didn't have anything that cared about treasures really in blue and wanted to be sacrificing treasures or anything, so I just never had a spot where it illogically fit. And then I built a deck fairly recently with EDHRECast Salvage Splicer in it, where whenever you sacrifice in any kind of an artifact, you put a counter on all of the golems you control. And it's a deck that makes a bunch of golems. Well, suddenly right there, then now I have this counter spell that makes a bunch of treasures. And if I'm countering a giant spell that costs 6-7 mana or something, that's 6 or 7 counters going on every single golem in that deck. It went from being a cool card I wanted to run to, frankly, almost a win condition in that deck, being able to put that many counters on my golems if I'm careful and wait for a big spell to come around. And similarly, Vesuvan Duplimancy is a relatively new card, but it's one of those cards that I remember looking at thinking, I love that card, and I'm never going to build a deck for it. Whenever you cast a spell that targets only a single artifact or creature you control, you create a token that's a copy of that artifact or creature. I just couldn't fathom what deck I would ever build that would run that. Well, that EDHRECast deck, I built it as a blink deck, so I can blink EDHRECast and the various other things that are splicers that make golems. Well, suddenly now I have the ability, anything I target to blink, I make a copy of that thing that then comes into play and brings another golem with it. It was a perfect deck for it, and it was a card that I was sure I was going to have sitting around for years looking for a home for, and it just so happened right after it came out, I built the perfect deck for it. So don't give up. You will eventually find something for these cards.
I love that.
Yeah, being patient with everything and just reminding yourself whenever, every now and then you're building a new deck, go through all those cards that you have laying around. I can just move to the side and you see all the cards I have laying around behind me. And there's a lot of them. And so anytime that I build a new deck or I'm looking at ways to kind of tinker around with decks, just go through those piles of cards. We know that you have them, everyone. We know that you have boxes of cards that you're not really using right now, and you've always wanted to put a home in them. Just just look through that every now and then and just like, oh yeah, this would be fun in my X deck. And then just give it a try. Don't kind of, well, but I want to try this card first. Just give it a try. Don't kind of get in your own way. Don't make things harder than it needs to be. Just pull out some random card, throw that one in there that you want to try, and maybe you surprise yourself too. Maybe something just jumps out and you discover something new about the deck too. It's why we play the game. It's so much fun to, oh yeah, I wonder what this would be like. And then you try and you're like, oh, that was so much better than I thought it would be.
And for me on this, I feel like having these cards that like, oh, I can't wait to try and find a place to make that work has actually led to me eventually, years down the line, creating decks that are like among my favorites. Like the reason that I was so keen to build a Thalisse Reverent Medium deck or just a black-white tokens deck in general is because of Maw of the Obzidad, which was just one of my favorite black-white cards. You sacrifice a creature and pump up your team. And I wanted a deck that would be able to facilitate that ability to have a bunch of stuff. And then eventually Thalisse came out. It was our Commander Legends preview card. And I was like, this is perfect. This is exactly what I've been looking for so that I can finally play the Maw of the Obzidad in the environment that I wanted to. At long last. Or with my Babala Saga deck, one of the reasons that she's so fun for me isn't just because of what Commander does, but it's also because I had wanted to have Mazarek in the 99 of one of my decks for a long time. And Babala Saga also gains life. And I was just like, ooh, can I use Blossoming Bog Beast in this deck as a potential win condition? Because she gains life and Blossoming Bog Beast will do a bunch of stuff if I've gained life. Like those are also experiences that like those decks are now some of my favorites because for years I was thinking of how can I make these cards work, and then eventually the stars finally aligned and it's way fun as a result of that. So yeah, guys, I love that advice, and I love that, don't give up on these. It might take a little while, but when they finally do get their chance to shine, boy are they gonna.
I totally agree, Joey. So with that said, why don't we go ahead and do as we did when we opened. Let's clean everything up a little bit. Joey was a little all over the place, but
wow,
that doesn't mean it has to stay dirty. Let's get clean here. Why don't we head out now?
Wow. Okay. Yes, Matt. Indeed, we shall. Trying to just
my Segway ability is in tatters, same as my curtains.
Oh my god. All right, listeners, we'd love to hear from you about the cards that you can't quite justify putting into decks. What are cards that you wish you could play a little bit more? Decks that you're just hoping to, cards that you're hoping to get a deck for them one of these days. Definitely let us know all about it. And when folks do want to get in touch with us, fellas, where is it that they can contact us on the onlines?
So you can find me on the social medias at Mathimus55 on pretty much any platform. Don't forget we are streaming. We stream Wednesday nights over at twitch.tv/EDHRECast where we have guests on whenever we stream. And it's always a blast. So make sure you tune in for that as well.
And Dana?
You can find me on Twitter at Dana Roach. I'm writing articles for EDHREC and Commander's Herald. And you can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast.
And I'm Joey Schultz. You can find me at Joseph M. Schultz, and you can find the cast at EDHRECast, basically anywhere online. Plus, if you've got a question for us, you can contact us at EDHRECast@gmail.com. Our thanks go out once again to Chase for assisting me with the post-production of the show. You can find them online at Mana Curves. And listeners, we'll be back at you next week with more data and insights, but until then, remember, EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck.